Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to another episode of AMUK podcast. We returned after quite a while, and today we will be talking about Tasawuf and Islam with our young scholar Shah Zuberi. You might have seen him already in our Principles of Hadith course, and today he'll be talking about a different topic that interests him, and we'll be having a conversation around it. So over to you, Shah. If you want, you can introduce yourself in terms of what is your interest in this topic and what kind of reading you've done around it, and you can jump straight into the topics that you want to discuss here.
First of all, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. So, when we are talking about Tasawuf, we are talking about the greatest intellectual current in Islam, right? So, whether it's scholars from the subcontinent, the Middle East, or North Africa, we will find giants like Imam al Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, even Ibn Taymiyyah to some degree, really talking about what God is, right? And I have found after a fair amount of reading that most of this was influenced by what we will term mysticism or tasawwuf. In that, as we later discuss, there are Neoplatonic tendencies, and then there are certain indigenous tendencies that were inherited from our philosopher. So that's really what we'll be talking about today. Just a brief introduction about myself. I'm an 18-year-old amateur researcher who researches things other people should perhaps not, because certain Sufi books are quite difficult to wrap our heads around, not because they're complex, but because it's very difficult to then reconcile um, their ideas with Orthodox creed. And that often creates a crisis of faith for many people. In fact, Imam al Ghazali famously went through that himself when he was paralyzed for a number of months because of the existential crises he had once he couldn't reconcile Sufi Tawheed with what he used to, talk about when he was a solid Ashari. So that's just a bit about myself.
And it's not just being about young. If you know anything about Sufism, it's less about intellectuality. It's less about uh, ideas of mind and more about experience. And if I haven't experienced that world, well, what exactly are we talking about? Because that's how they'll see it. Because
No,
they'll
because
think, well, hmm,
you're absolutely right, because every Sufi, no matter how
hmm,
orthodox, even people like Shah Waliullah will emphasize in Hujjatullah al-Baligha and other books
hmm,
that God can only be properly understood once you witness him. Now, for common people like you and me,
hmm.
witnessing God, Akhirat is where, we thought that would happen.
Yeah.
Specifically in the paradigm, we would
If
see God.
if that would happen, right? We don't even know, even in the next world, that would
Yeah,
necessarily happen.
yes, absolutely. That there is definitely
Depends on
going
what is
to.
your creed, right? Whether he will show himself,
Or
can he show himself, or he won't show himself, and then we'll have to just
I think
make do with everything that he's promised us, in terms of if we, inshallah, go to paradise, right? Believing in the right things.
so yeah, no, if you're, for example, Shia and
Mm,
are inspired by the Mu'tazilis of the classical era, then yes, absolutely, you will say that it isn't really a question of whether God is capable of showing himself. It's a question of whether that befits him and whether the human being is actually capable of handling that vision, right? Because we've seen
mm,
in the case of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam that
mm,
even though there was an unveiling of some sort,
mm.
the vision could not be tolerated,
Of course.
heightened.
Yeah.
So there are things like that. So here I'd just like to begin with what we understand Tawheed to be in traditional conservative Orthodox Ashari Sunni Islam.
Mm,
So a short summary here would be something you find in Al-Aqid al-Tahawiyya, for example, that God is the creator of everything. He engaged in creation ex nihilo, that is, creation from nothing.
Mm,
He is beyond the six directions, so you can't say God is above anything, or you can't say God is below anything. You can't say God is left, right, or north, south, east, west. And then God is entirely distinct from the creation. Now, this part here, God is entirely distinct from creation, created a question for Sufis and philosophers in general, where existence is technically shared then because everything exists. So
hmm.
existence is a higher form of being.
I mean,
And once,
existence is being, right? Existence being same word, right?
no, for us, normal people, yes. But for the
Yeah.
philosophically minded elite, the
Mm,
khawas, we call them, either it is that God, Nauzubillah, has partners in something, in this
mm.
case, existence, or he doesn't. Now, the
But then that
Sufi,
that depends on what is your fundamental definition or million definition of Tawheed. If you think that Tawheed is what Quran commonly talks about when we say La ilaha illallah. So when we say La ilah, right? So there is no God worthy of worship because we are talking about worship here.
but just
So
to
nobody
play,
nobody else should be worshipped, right? If we look at it like that, existence is not a problem. A can exist, B can exist. That is not a problem because if only A is worshipped, then the criteria is met. If
no,
we say that Tawheed is only one thing should exist, right? Then anything other than that creates that problem.
so that's where we're going. So while I agree with you in principle and generally, but for Sufis, there was a desire to prove that God is entirely unique, and God is entirely unique, even as the Quran says, "Laysa kamithlihi shay." The question here is, does existence fall in this paradigm? Is that something we can even grasp? Now, the philosopher, however they were, emphasized that through rational reasoning, we can arrive, forgive me, speculative reasoning, we can eventually arrive at, well, the being of God, his nature, to some degree. Even they emphasize that you can't really fully grasp God, but you can get an idea. The Sufis went a step further. They said that you can actually witness God. And here I'd just like to point out that Sufis are not one dimensional. There is a diverse creed found amongst them. In fact, your everyday average Sufi will be an Ashari Maturidi, and they will hold a perfectly orthodox viewpoint of God. Sure,
Mm.
Salafis might call that heretical in and of themselves, but by and large, most Muslims have always held that idea. In fact, even Mu'tazilis, or in this case, the Imamis now, will also hold more or less the same belief about God. There will be a semantic difference here or there about what precisely is an attribute or how precisely God possesses attributes. But the conclusion that was reached after all of these debates fully unfolded, right? You had the Mihna, and then you had that entire episode of the debate regarding Khalq al Quran and others, after which the entire discourse existed before you. People like Mufti Muhammad Abduhu, Rashid Rida, and then obviously various other highly respected scholars from the Maghrib, especially, who delved in Kalam and in Syria. They'd say that no, the Mu'tazilis were fine. There's nothing really that heretical about them, and that these debates were really just the result of some semantic differences that were not understood because not everyone had a philosophical background. But the Sufis, as I said, went a step further. They said that since we can know God, let's try knowing God. Now, every Sufi tariqa has its own, well, method or methodology to witnessing God. You have the Chishti tariqa, you have the Qadiri silsila, you have the Sohrawardiya. Now, these are heavily guarded secrets. In fact, many mashayikh of tasawwuf would say that it is kufr to actually express these things. So far, I've only found one book, and I think you gave that to me online, something about the Sohrawardiya Silsila and their practices vis-a-vis knowing God. So It's a series of exercises, meditative repetitions of zikr that essentially send you into a trance. And there they witness things. They call it the unveiling, kashf or ilham. And it is likened to wahi.
I mean, if you take wahi as a conversation between God and somebody else, whoever that might be, right? So if you can achieve a state where you are having a conversation with God, then you are receiving wahi, one way or the other.
It
And
doesn't.
and and what I understand of this unveiling is really that as they begin to focus on God, whichever tools they employ for that purpose, right? What they have experienced as they work towards is everything else, everything else around them, and in an ultimate sense, even themselves. Everything else, including themselves, is ultimately a veil between them and God. And as they slowly remove all of these things, eventually they experience God, and they experience that there is nothing else except Him, and that's it.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, right? So the Sufi creed is very simple in a manner of speaking, I guess. It says that La mawjood illallah, all that exists is God. Or a better translation would be God alone exists, nothing else. Then the question is, what are we? Early Sufis would say, and this is perhaps where the confusion really comes from. Early Sufis in who were not influenced by this conception of God, they interpreted all creatures to be indicatives or ayat of God. All things, me, you, trees, greenery, anything, was a sign of God. And now you see where the confusion arises from. If everything is a sign of God, why precisely is it a sign of God? What about it makes it a sign of God? So, for Sufis, they have a conception of God whereby everything else that exists is a reflection of Him. Creation ex nihilo took place. It just isn't what is commonly understood as creation. When we understand creation, we think of something other than God existing. And that is what any general, no, forgive me, normal person will surmise from the Quran as well. That there was God, He existed before everything else was. And then after a certain point in time, once time became a thing, other things also began to exist, but it is God alone that exists in the way that He exists. He is Al Awwal and Al Akhir. That is, it cannot be said that there was anything before Him, and it cannot be said that there will be anything that can live after Him. He will always be there, He is constant. Everything else is temporal, even though as human beings we do have an eternal existence, but that is eternal when it comes to the end. That is, we will always subsist, not that we have always been subsisting. That's a key distinction here. So the common conception of God found amongst Ashari theologians was that God exists and we exist, but God exists in a way that is unlike anything else's existence. That's basically what it was, right? Because we
That's
keep life.
that's part of uniqueness, right? That is part of
Yes.
uniqueness.
And then they would draw a line, not necessarily always. They would try to analyze some things here and there, but there was a general line that, okay, now this deals with God's Zat, His being. While we know God's attributes, we do not know things about His being.
That is
And
what Surah Ikhlas is about as well.
right? And like Sakamislihi Shah makes it clear that we can't grasp Him, and then various ayat, like, for example, about the soul, that we can't grasp the soul or what it is. And even though we call it soul, it's really Ruhullah, right? So it's things like this. But Sufism makes it abundantly clear that no, specifically Ibn Arabi, that is something I should probably mention right about now. Before Ibn Arabi, that his era is sometime in the 13th century. You had this conception of God existing. It was there in certain people's minds. Al-Hallaj famously proclaimed himself to be God. He made some form of a pledge of divinity. Bayezid al-Bastami, or as he's known in the Middle East, Abu Yazid al-Bastami, famously said that, once again made a very sort of divine-esque remark about himself. So that was because they were witnessing God.
Mm.
And in their trance,
Or were they witnessing God, or were they, as the Sufi creed goes, were they realizing that actually, you know, they are not, they are not
distinct.
really present. They are not really
Yeah,
present, right?
yeah, that
What
was
is
the real,
what is present is God, right? So if
all that.
somebody is saying Anal Haq, they are not saying that I too am God. They are just saying there is God, and
There
what
is
you are
God.
witnessing, what you are witnessing is God. So if you are witnessing me, Anal Haq,
And,
right? So,
and the beauty of this is that since all that exists is God alone exists, technically speaking, everyone worships the same God.
mm,
You can worship an idol, but technically all you're doing is worshiping God.
mm, mm,
And various things of this nature. And you find them. So I will say this: the Middle Eastern Sufis were slightly more orthodox. You wouldn't find them bowing towards an idol, but
mm,
here in South Asia, you will find a few instances of very respected people like Mohyuddin Chishti and others
mm,
doing things of this effect. And therefore, kufr and shirk and all of these distinctions that we orthodox people draw,
right.
which is why every perennialist that has ever lived is also a Sufi. You can
I mean,
reconcile.
they would find more resonance with Sufism because it would endorse the idea that there is a common thread, there is a common core, there is a central religion across time and space, right?
And that central
And,
religion isn't
mm,
necessarily revealed via a prophet. That is what we
mm,
will understand to be mysticism. So
yeah,
Buddhism, Hinduism,
mm,
Gnosticism, Kabbalah, all of
mm,
those strands
everything, yeah.
technically form the thread of the unity of religion. A Gnostic or a Hindu mystic can actually have the same belief as a Sufi.
I mean, belief is again, as we spoke about it at the beginning, that it's belief is very intellectual. Belief is often about statements, ideas,
Yeah,
claims,
that,
stuff like that. But
yeah.
when you are working at an experiential level, it's hardly, you're not making statements there. You are witnessing, right? It's immediate. It's there. It's in front of you. It's
Yeah.
it's a direct perception.
And then
So
it depends.
when you're looking at things like that, it's a completely different thing that we are talking about.
So Sufi visions often were along the lines of witnessing a sun or
Mm,
witnessing rays of light emanating from the same source. So in the Sohrawardiya Silsila, especially, and forgive me, Ishraqi Silsila, especially, that strand of mysticism, we find this emphasis on light to be there, that all things emanate from the same light. Everything has a reflection, perhaps, or a better word would be everything is enlightened by that same source.
mm,
So and the more distant you are from that source, i.e., the more evil you are, the less light you will have, the less light
mm,
you will possess, the less bright you will be.
mm. I wonder. I
So
mean, I wonder if reflection is is a correct word to describe this, because reflection requires something to reflect off of, right?
so they do believe something to reflect off.
They do
They do.
believe the existence of something
No, no,
else.
it's no, no, no. So let's just talk about this for Ibn Arabi's
Mm,
conception, right? So that's what we call Akbari Tasawwuf,
mm,
Akbari Sufism. That was probably the most influential strand of doctrinal tasawwuf, as perhaps Gandhi Sahib would call it. In terms of their theological opinion, it's essentially this: the being of God exists. Now, the being of God exists and creates. How does it create? God's knowledge is eternal, correct? God's knowledge is technically a reflection of everything that's happening right now. So, for an Ashari who would also say this, they would say, well, God just created everything as a reflection of that attribute. But this is where the Akbari Sufi would say, oh, so that means there's a likeness between God's knowledge and everything that exists. And
mm,
they would be like, why are you going there? That's not what I mean. I mean everything. is naturally just God knows everything and he's always known everything. Therefore, everything that's happening. Also, the Akbari Sufi would say, ah, yes, see, so everything that's happening here right now is happening within the being of God. So
It
why draw
can't
the
be.
distinction?
It can't be anywhere else except the being of God, right?
Right? God's
Mm.
being possessed knowledge.
Mm.
So as a result, what are we? That's the central question. We are smoke and mirrors,
Yeah.
just the process of God reflecting Himself to Himself, for
Yeah.
Himself,
Yeah.
forever.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah. So I mean that's
According,
that goes back to the earlier point as well, right? Where um, I was talking about everything being a veil, right? Everything
yeah,
that is covering the reality from us, right? So once the veils are off, you see things for what they are.
yeah, and you'll find that they're empty. Hence, when Hallaj or Bayezid Bastami or Fariduddin Attar or are great or Rumi for that matter are saying certain things that most people would really be like, what?
Mm,
Words. They're not actually committing shirk in their minds.
of course.
They're not, because all that exists is God. And technically, they're at the pinnacle of monotheism. And the very surprising part is that even Imam al Ghazali does perhaps agree with some part of it. And this is where I'd like to quote his Ihya. So I believe in the fourth book of Ihya. So Imam al-Ghazali writes, therefore it should be obvious that the ultimate of all disciplines of mystic intuition is this Tawheed. And the secrets of this discipline cannot be written in any book because according to the saying of the Arifs, those who have achieved awareness, exposing the secrets of the divine modes amounts to infidelity, as in kufr. What is this? What are we really talking about, right? So as I said, Ibn Arabi is really the primary point of reference for everything. Ghazali was there in the 11th century. He predates Ibn Arabi by some 200 years or so. So these ideas are less clear to people of Ghazali's era. They are, however, much more elucidated post Ibn Arabi. So in Fusus al Hikam, Ibn Arabi writes, existence is one reality. You can't divide it. You can't say something exists and another thing exists because at the end of the day, they both share an existence. And then he says, it is defined by the diffusion of Allah into the existence by the form.
Mm.
So God's being, it diffuses itself. That is, it splits.
I mean, it can't
But not,
split, right? Split into two.
no,
It can't.
no, it's not splitting into two. By that we mean it just appears as if it's splitting, just an appearance, just as the sun gives off light, right? And
Mm.
rays are technically separate, but technically they're not.
Mm.
They're the same thing. That's this kind of fusion. Thus, as a corollary to everything that has a form, it's an outward incarnation of God. And once again, the words here, forgive me, but the vocabulary to really describe them is very limited. So when I say incarnation of God, that once again implies that, okay, God is another being, and then there's another being. No, it's the same thing. But there's no other word in any language, including Arabic or Farsi or Hindi or Sanskrit, to really describe this. Because we
Mm.
are limited by, well, I guess rationality, but
Mm.
whatever it is,
Yeah.
not really understand that.
So I mean,
So,
as we say in the law of conservation of energy, you can't create energy, you can't destroy energy. It can only change forms.
yes,
So,
which is why a lot of modern Sufis are actually very passionate
mm.
physicists somehow.
Mm.
Yeah, about Adam in specific, Ibn Arabi says, formation of the body of Adam, his outer form, and formation of his spirit, his inner form, is so he is the real and a created being. So this is how the being of God diffused into Adam, or sort of showed itself to be Adam.
Mm.
As a result of this doctrine, God and creation would be one existence. So Ibn Arabi professes, even though the creature is distinct from the creator, the matter is that the creature and creature slash creator is that the creature is the creator and the creator is the creature. That is
Anal
from
Haq.
yeah, that's what it means. Yes. That is from one source. Rather, it is the one source and it is many sources. Look at what you see. That technically it's one source, but we perceive it to be many sources. You and I are made of earth, jinns are made of fire, trees are made from something else.
Hmm.
And in theory, or forgive me, appearance dictates that these have many sources.
Hmm.
At its most abstract core, they're all the same. There's a
Yeah.
unity, there's an underlying principle.
Unity of diversity.
Yeah, unity of diversity, yes.
Yeah.
So, as we later discuss, we have various stages of how this entire process takes place, and then we really see how God appears to be divided. Appears. Once again, the
Hmm.
core word being appears, but the real issue here is none of this is actually happening. None of this actually matters. It's immaterial. So, in the Sufi conception of the afterlife, they're one with their beloved.
Hmm.
I think when I say that phrase, I'm quoting what, maybe 100 Sufi poets?
Hmm.
From
Yep.
Rumi to Attar to Shirazi,
Hmm.
everyone
Hmm.
constantly one phrase to be one with the beloved.
Yep. Yep. As Rumi's famous song of the reed goes, basically what is the reed crying about? Because it
That,
was separated. It was
yeah,
separated from its source.
yes.
That is what it's crying about. That is what it's
So
wailing about.
the conception of God is very difficult to then arrive at in this entire paradigm, right? Because now you have blurred the lines quite literally between creation and between what a created entity is.
Mm.
Whether that created entity can be said to exist, technically, no, technically. However, it is an undeniable fact that we do have a presence. That presence is nothing other than smoke and mirrors. That's
Mm.
really that. Just as you can say a ray of light is separate from the sun, even though it's not, it just appears to be, it's still the sun.
Yep.
And that's what these exercises and all of these tariqas, I assume, focus on. I've only ever read the Sohrawardias, but I guess by a process of deduction, I'd have to say that that's what they really focus on. They'll focus on the source of light.
Mm.
Sufis have been quite open about their visions. Almost every
Mm.
Sufi or sheikh has a has a series of letters
Mm.
that detail and describe their visions. So you know, definitely an interesting conception. This is Wahdatul Wajud. That is the unity of all existence. There is
Mm.
another invented in the subcontinent by Mujaddid al-Fisani,
Sheikh Sirhandi.
Sheikh Ahmed
Mm.
Sirhandi. So I'll just have to quote him here. Rather, I'll just quote myself.
Mm.
About Wahdatul Shahud, this statement of Sheikh Abdul Momin, who was once again a Sufi, quoted by Iqbal in his reconstruction of religious thought, summarizes its nature. Heaven and earth, and God's throne, and hell and paradise have all ceased to exist for me. When I look around, I find them nowhere. When I stand in the presence of somebody, I see nobody before me. Even my own being is lost to me. God is infinite, nobody can encompass him, and this is the extreme limit of spiritual existence. So, in Wahdatul Wajud, the vision would be that they are the sun. Here, they are witnessing the sun.
Mm.
That,
So,
that's that's
do we really mean that the witness and the witnessed, these two are two separate beings?
so
Because if you say beings, then it can't be Batul Wajud because
no,
Wahat has been broken.
this is Wahdatul Shahud. So Mujaddid al-Fasani was a firm critic of Wahdatul Wajud.
Mhm.
Except, as Shah Waliullah would show, I believe, some 2 centuries later, 2.5 centuries later, they're
These
still
are
the
just
same.
semantics. These are just
Yeah,
semantics. Yeah.
they're just semantics
They're
because
essentially talking about the same thing.
yes, the metaphor he used was if you look at the number two, it is one plus one, right? One plus one. But technically, you can look at the number two in its totality as well. So the people of Wahdatul Shahud would look at one plus one. It still equals two. Whereas the people of Wahdatul Wajud focus on two
The
as a whole.
holistic view. Hmm.
Yeah. So that's really just it. Because even here, Sheikh Abdul Momin does say, right, I lost conception of myself. He's not himself here either. So that's really it here.
Because
That's
that's the final veil, right?
that's the
Once you've eliminated every other veil, the final veil that is left is yourself, is your
yeah,
own ego, is your own recognition of yourself. The moment that disappears, what is left behind? The final being, and that's God.
that's still it. So here now we proceed to the zenith of this doctrine, right? Ibn Arabi calls it supreme union. And Shah Waliullah describes it as, you used the word veil very aptly. He says, the veils separating from the divine were pulled aside and they were able to see existence physically emanating from being. They became lost in being and their individual selves were colored with his color. So earlier we spoke about the diffusion of God into creation, or the transmutation or transfiguration, whatever you want to call it, because there can be 100 different translations of this one word. But that's what's happening. All beings are therefore colored by his color, and they all emanate from the same source. This is where I'd like to point out the Neoplatonic influence. Now, I'm not particularly well read on conventional Neoplatonism. I've only ever looked at it from the Sufi mystical paradigm, but as it generally goes, there is a being, the source. There is a first emanation, and a second emanation, and a third emanation, depending on whether you are a whether you're a Christian mystic, or whether you're a Jewish mystic or a Hindu mystic. The first emanation can be different. So, abstract Neoplatonists call it the intellect. In our paradigm, it's called the pen. Shah Waliullah, for example, says that the first creation was the pen. But other people would say that the first creation was the nafsikulliya, which is, once again, like the intellect. But then everyone, at least in our paradigm, agrees that the third creation was the tablet, or at least the pen. And that's where the rest of creation originates from. And we see here, especially, that there are layers of existence. There are gradations in this coloring scheme. There are gradations of light. Whichever Sufi paradigm you look at it from, there are levels to existence. So technically, there are six. Depending on the conception and the trend of Sufism you are reading, those can differ. The only other count I found is five, because Shah Waliullah does not recognize the first station as a distinct state of existence. He recognizes that as being in general. So the first is Martabe Ula. Here, being is abstract. You can't even call it God. Being is
It's not defined by any
anything,
attributes yet.
nothing.
It's
It's
it's just pure existence.
pure existence, and this is eerily similar to Taoism. If you read the Tao teaching, you'll find them saying almost the exact thing, that the Tao is being itself. It's abstract to the highest degree. It has no fixities, it has no quiddities, it cannot be attributed by anything. Even the idea of negation or negating attributes. So, for example, certain philosophers, rather than saying God is knowledgeable, they would say God is not ignorant, right? Because they said that the best way to understand God is to understand him by negating what he is not. You can't even do that here. So this is the Martabeula. The God is unknowable. In fact, existence is there. They don't call that God.
Hmm.
God comes a stage later in what Shah Waliullah calls the Martabe Ahadiya. Here, being has the fixity of divinity. That's it. And in this stage, there is no other it's just divinity. In Urdu, we'd call it Khalis Uluhiyat. That's all. Then there is the Martabe Wahdiya. Here is the God that we all know: merciful, benevolent, forgiving. Here, the attributes are more concrete, they've been taken on by being. These are the first three stages, so to speak, and they are regarded as pre eternal. They are Qadim. You cannot say there was a particular point when they began existing. No, they've always been there. You cannot say that there is a particular point when they will stop existing. No, they'll always be there. After the third stage, where in our paradigm the kalima kun is issued and God says kun, the other three stages are fayakun. They are the alame amsal, alame arwa, and alame ajsa.
Yeah, the alame amsal, the realm of forms sounds very, very platonic.
That is exactly what I was going to say, and thought we'll bring that up later. But chale, agar baat ho gayi hai, so let's talk about that for a second. I have Shah Waliullah's magnum opus, Hujjatul al-Baliga, right here. In his first chapter, yes, here we are. So the world of images, Alame Amsal. This stage comes after the process of creation has begun, as in it comes in after Kun has been delivered. Here we, before that we have the, yeah, so that's where the creation takes place in its abstract form. So he says, be informed that many traditions of the Prophet indicate that a non elemental world exists in which abstract meanings are represented by quasi bodily forms corresponding to them in quality. There, things take on their materialization in some form before they are materialized on earth. Thus, when they come into existence, they are the same in a certain sense of sameness. So, in this stage, everything that exists has an abstract form.
That's
Everything.
Platonism. That's just
Yeah.
Platonism.
That's just Platonism. You can read the allegory of the caves. This is basically that. There's a realm where the perfect version of everything exists. Except here we say because it's amsal, it's similitude, things aren't literal. So you have a hadith in Bukhari which says Surah Baqarah and Al Imran will be two falcons or two birds flying on the day of judgment. Shah Waliullah says that that is from the Alam Amsal. That is
Okay.
what is there. And there are several ahadith to this effect. So ahadith about the pen, ahadith about the tablet, ahadith about various forms of creation. Even to some degree, well, I don't think those are in any way authentic, but even those about the creation of mankind, from the Israeli riwayat that we have in our own books, might be happening there by this methodology. Shavalur doesn't say that himself, but if I was to really extend that to the whole scope of metaphoric interpretation, then I'd say, well, that's probably one of those things as well. It is at this stage that we have the insane kamil, perfect human. And every human, well, I guess we're skipping a stage, so I'll just talk about the stage in between. That's the alame arwa. Every living thing has a soul. Now, we don't know what the soul is. That's an issue, but not for Sufis. They know exactly what the soul is. Um, a spirit.
I mean, have they claimed that they know what a soul is? Because,
Yes.
you and I both know what a soul is at the level of the idea, at the level of conception, that, you know, it is something, right? And God
No,
said that I created all the souls, right? So we
no,
know at a concept level what a soul is, but what it really means, at a concrete level, what it is, we don't know what it is, right? And then, Allah said in Quran that we have not given you much information about this.
yeah, that's exactly it. So, on the matter of the soul, I do like to generally remain silent. But if
Mm.
I was to guess, and this is entirely a guess, I would say that the soul is probably our consciousness.
Maybe, yeah,
Probably,
this is quite a modern way of
right?
looking at things.
Probably. I mean, one
Mm.
can, again, we don't know for sure. And
Mm.
I don't think there's any point of ever trying to figure it out either.
Yeah.
Because I guess we can take a little detour off to Descartes for a bit. I do think dualism is a thing.
Mm.
Probably, once again,
Mm.
based off the
Mm.
very limited information we have, I guess you and I are in some ways an avatar of our consciousness.
Mm.
I think so at least. But there's nothing conclusive on that, regardless.
Mm.
So in the Alame Arwa, this abstraction now becomes even more divided. You have separate entities who have a shared existence, so they are all human and they are all separate, they are all distinct, they all have their unique experience,
Mm.
but they are still reflections of the Insane Kamil, and that is what they are modeled after. And then in the
Mm.
Alam al we are given bodies, and everything becomes properly physical, properly material. So in
Mm.
the Alam Amsal, as we mentioned, Shah Waliullah, um, they're quasi-bodily. In the Alam-e Arwa, they begin to take shape, they begin to take some sort of form.
Hmm.
And then it is only in the Alam-e Ajsam that they really materialize properly, concretely.
Hmm. Hmm.
So you can imagine it as wisps of smoke. That's what it's probably like in the Alam-e Arwa, in this, sorry, huh? Yes, Alam-e Arwa. That's what's probably like.
Hmm.
And I guess that fits in with the whole paradigm of God blowing a spirit into us, right? There's a wisp of smoke. Something to that nature can probably be said in a Sufi paradigm. And so we've seen here that we've talked about the Tanazzulat Sitta, the 6 stages or 6 stages of descent. That's what they call them. It's quite alien
Hmm.
for a layperson. I
Hmm.
don't think anyone ever really
Hmm.
thinks in this
But I
direction.
wonder for a, well, it might mean different things for different people at different points in time in history. But for a
Yes.
modern person, I draw a parallel. You know, for people familiar with evolution, we have the tree of life, right? Where there's a single source at the top, and it kind of
I mean, if you,
descends
while
into various forms, right? Various I don't know, species or genuses or whatever, various
there's
levels of
a,
forms are, right? So there is descent into various forms, and then forms, you know in real world, they appear as instances. They appear as like 100, you know tigers, for example, or 100 fish of some sort, right? So there are instances. So the three levels that you talk about of creation: form and ruh and body, right? So the body and ruh, if you combine them, one, because modern science wouldn't probably look at them in two different ways, then form, and then the body and soul, right? So from that tree of life, I think we witness it, right? And there's a form that you draw on that chart, and then there's the actual instances of those forms that are the living beings that are living on this planet. Yeah. So it sounds very modern in that sense, creation,
I mean,
and there's the
here,
idea of single source behind it.
okay, I guess we can talk about this as well.
Mm,
To me, it is undeniable that yes, there is some form of an underlying unity. The one you mentioned is a prime example of that, that there is something
mm,
that does unite everything that we see.
mm,
In my conception, at least, that's the command of God,
mm,
that all things originated not from God himself, but rather from his command.
mm,
That kalama, right? That kun, as we call it. And that was God's, that was a materialization of his intent, his will, his qudra, his amr. And that then eventually became everything.
yeah.
Now,
But that sounds very, very traditional, in the sense that that sounds very Sharia compliant, in the sense that
so
that must be a very, very, very orthodox view.
it's not been vocalized in this sense before.
Mm,
While I wouldn't say I'm the only one, I wouldn't say
mm.
this
And
is
I
a
mean,
very,
the Quran talks about it like this, right? Of course, right?
yeah, it
The
does.
Quran says that Allah said kun, and then there it was, right?
There it was, right? So everything is united by that word of God.
Mm,
And if we look at the Gospel of John, while most Muslims tend to reject that verse, I do use it as evidence of this. The first verse, right? It says, "There was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," and so on and so forth.
mm,
But the later part of that paragraph says, "And then the Word became Jesus."
mm.
I would probably say that what was probably being talked about there
Was kun
initially,
fayakun.
yes,
Mm,
literally yes, that's
okay.
what it was. And then I have no problems in accepting the Alame Arwa or the Alame Amsal or the
Mm,
Alame Atsam. Those distinctions can then be accepted because a lot of Sufis aren't wrong when they're talking about their whole unity thing. I just think that they were wrong about the source. The
mm,
source was the word. That was the underlying principle of unity.
mm,
But then this does create a larger theological debate about what the word of God is, because eventually, if you're taking the Ashari conception, then you will end up with the same conception as the Sufis.
Yeah. No, but then that's what is the word of God was a point of debate between Mu'tazila, right, and the non-Mu'tazila, right, because for Mu'tazila this was a point of objection that
And
Quran does call.
objection.
Sorry, what?
And this is why it was a point of objection. The whole debate
Yeah,
started because of the Gospel of John, and
yeah,
because certain Christian missionaries said that, well, the Quran calls Hazrat Isa alayhi salam Kalimatullah, word of
Kalimatullah.
God.
And the problem is the word separate from God? Is the word co-eternal with God? If it is, what's the distinction
I mean,
between
as a
Muslim
working,
creed and Christian creed?
as a working theory,
Mm,
so I initially did accept the Mu'tazili position
mm,
until Imam Razi really helps in this regard,
mm,
because he really vocalizes a lot of very proto-Ashari ideas, even though, yes, people like Al-Baqillani and others did voice something to that effect. But Razi is really a turning point because he really just describes what Kalam-e-Lafzi is.
right.
So he'll say that Kalam-e-Nafsi is an attribute. We affirm that. He does try to understand what it is. I don't agree with that part. But he does say that, well, that exists with the being of God. It's eternal, like mercy, like will, like whatever else.
Mm,
However, Kalam-e-Lafzi is a creation. He says it outrightly. And he's, I believe, the first Ashari to really just say it. Because this issue was very controversial. Fatawa of Kufr were delivered on this, until eventually we just stopped caring. Eventually, once the dust settled and once a significant amount of blood had been lost,
mm,
everyone stopped caring. So you can really, I've often told you about that article Norman Calder wrote, or Norman Calder. I'm still
mm,
lost at how one says his name. But he really describes the trend our books of creed take. So in the first century, the very early books like Al-Aqidah Tahawiya or Al-Fiqh al-Akbar of Imam Abu Hanifa, Al-Fiqh al-Akbar, let's just take that, even if it's not Abu Hanifa's himself, it's definitely quite early. There's an there's a debate on what Iman is.
mm-hmm,
Who in the 90 of let's forget that. Who in the 15th century cared about the definition of Iman? No one. The Murji'a ceased to exist. Whatever debate there was, it didn't exist anymore. Similarly, if we look at this debate, Behas Khalq al Quran, that falls out of parlance for a few hundred years until modernity.
mm,
And even modernity, it only really became an issue when the Salafiyah decided to, well, go on a bit of an intellectual renaissance, I guess, where they started quoting Imam Ahmad, and then people like Al-Razi or people like um, Al-Maturidi and people like Imam Abul Hasan al-Ashari and people like Ghazali, and
mm,
said that there's a clear difference between what the Salaf are saying and what you guys are saying when it comes to Khalq al-Quran and whether or not it is a thing. But it's not relevant. As in, so for example, the Shia believe that the Quran is created.
mm-hmm,
They don't draw a distinction between Kalam-e-Lafzi and Kalam-e-Nafsi. But out of all the fatwa of kufr I've seen towards the Shia, which I don't agree with, but regardless, I have never once seen, ever, from the time of Ibn Taymiyyah till now, a fatwa of kufr being delivered on the basis of that belief. Never.
right. So
It lost
people
meaning.
of this age do not care about that early debate,
No, and
which
not just this.
mm,
Let's just talk about Ghazali for a second in Tahafut al-Falasifa. Now, the Falasifa are the agreed upon heretics of Islam for by the Imamiyya, by everyone really. So there's really no debate that yes, Ibn Sina had problematic beliefs. Al Farabi had problematic beliefs. Ibn Rushd, he is, as you know, a Maliki jurist of the highest level, right? Al Bidayat al Mujtahid is, well, a Mujtahid's guide. A man was
mm,
writing that. Clearly, the man knew his fiqh essentials and clearly knew the Islamic texts to their absolute core. But he was an avid Aristotelian, and Ibn Taymiyyah famously says he is the most Muslim of these kafir, of these kuffar. He is the most Muslim of them, or he is the least kafir of, or his kufr is the least major when we look at
mm,
the.
mm.
Ghazali says
He's
that
the best of the worst, basically.
the best of the worst. Yes, so he still.
Mm,
I'm not sure if Ibn Taymiyyah quotes him, but you will find Ibn Rushd still quoted in Salafi things.
yeah.
They'll still use that. That's quite a compliment, by the way.
Yeah, I
Just
think this is a practical problem, right? Because if you have to live in the world and you have to live with people who do not appreciate these complex ideas, then you have to have a bit of orthodoxy. So
no.
yeah, I'm sure at every century from the beginning, in the last 1400 years, in every century we would have uh, Sufis who are very heretical and Sufis who are what I call Sharia compliant, in the sense that they practice
Yeah,
Sharia as well.
they do. So the thing is that regarding Sharia compliant Sufis, there
Mm,
was a trend, specifically in early Tasawwuf, where you had a few cases where people were like, well, the Sharia doesn't apply on us anymore.
mm,
However, as you know, we are a very practical religion, as in
yeah.
practice focused. That caused quite a storm. So Ibn Arabi, no matter how abstract his beliefs are,
Mm.
is a very Sharia compliant Sufi to the
He is,
extent, very
yes,
Sharia compliant to the extent that he is a Zahiri when it comes to fiqh.
right.
He forbids the use of ijtihad specifically. Well, I guess chaos, but let's just say he
Mm.
generally the use of chaos. Yeah,
And so
it
was
is.
Ghazali. So was Ghazali. So that's why he's still the template of what a Sharia compliant Sufi is.
I think Ghazali really marks a turning point
Mm.
in tasawwuf and its acceptance. So we have figures in Islamic uh, history and the intellectual tradition who make something acceptable.
Yep.
So before Imam Abul Hasan Ashari, Kalam was the devil's work, quite literally. I'm
Yep.
quoting like 20 people on this, including Imam Malik, who would say that Kalam is the devil's work, stay away from it. Post Imam Abul Hasan Ashari, it became one of the righteous sciences. If we look at philosophy, even everyone studies mantiq now, don't they?
Mm.
In right?
Yep.
There was a reconciliation at some point, and I think Ibn Rushd is really the, I guess, whole responsible for that because he was really an orthodox, generally orthodox man who was also an Aristotelian. But the thing here is that the Aristotelians were never really as problematic as the Neoplatonists because Ibn Rushd's most controversial belief was that he affirmed the pre-existence of the world. But then he had certain philosophical tawil. I don't know the plural of tawil, but he had certain interpretations, certain explanations, which he used to reconcile with, you know, Orthodox creed. And he'd say, well, it's not like the universe existed as it does now,
Mm.
right? Sort of transmutation of some sort, and etc. etc. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the Islamic tradition is a very dynamic tradition. You cannot at any point say that orthodoxy today is what orthodoxy was back then.
Yep. Yep.
And even and I'll say that about the Salafis as well. You cannot say that the earliest Salaf were talking about the things that are being spoken about today. You
Mm.
can say that they had the same ideas about the attributes of God that you are saying today. Even Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, even though he's one of our earliest, scholars, especially to receive high repute, you cannot say that he would have agreed with a lot of things that Ibn Taymiyyah said.
Mm.
So, in fact, you can find things uh, to the negative.
Yeah. I mean, it's constantly evolving. It's constantly challenged. Constantly kind of reforms itself, and
That's
it takes new shapes, new forms. You know.
Calder's hypothesis, or Calder's hypothesis in his article, is that the Sunni movement is primarily a reactionary movement. So there's a trend
Mm,
that's going on. You'll have some new current that develops, and then
mm,
Sunniism will respond to that. And for a century or two, there will be a great amount of debate about it and a great amount of rejection of it.
mm,
And then 100, 200, 300 years later, you'll find a point of reconciliation.
mm.
And then
No,
other
but then
strand.
that's something we can say about the Ahl Sunnah wal Jamaa, that they are a reaction to Shiism, they are a reaction to
Kharijis.
Mutazilism, they
Yeah.
are a reaction to Kharjiism, they are a reaction to Falasifa, they are a reaction to all sorts of other trends, and then they've acquired a shape which
Yeah.
somehow
That
finds a
is,
different position from all of them.
a lot of Mu'tazili books aren't extant, as you
Hmm.
know. But the data we do find is in refutations.
Yep.
Now, the beauty of the situation is that those writings only survive in those refutations.
Hmm.
So the Sunni tradition ends up really just absorbing the other side, whatever is acceptable. In this case, specifically for Sufism, there was a lot of disagreement, and Ibn Taymiyyah really demarcates that very clearly. He, delivers fatwa of kufr against Ibn Arabi and really goes on a rampage against an intellectual rampage against the Akbari doctrine. And well, 400 years later, you have barely any Sufis who are challenging the doctrine anymore. But despite that, I do want to emphasize something. This is my interpretation of what Ibn Arabi is saying. This is also a lot of
Of
other
course, of
people's
course.
interpretation of what Ibn Arabi is saying,
Yep.
because these books, they're very metaphorical. Even though Ibn Arabi in Fusus al-Hikam at the very beginning does say all that I'm saying is not metaphorical, take heed.
Hmm.
Um, Despite that very explicit warning, um, there are very respectable scholars, especially from the Maghrib, who have argued that Ibn Arabi was an Ashari, a very staunch Ashari.
Okay.
And while I see that is very difficult to believe,
Reconcile. Hmm.
yeah, it's very difficult to see that, because while I'm not an Ashari myself, I mean, for all practical purposes, mostly every Sunni is an Ashari, for all
Hmm.
practical purposes.
Hmm.
So if you are from this strand of Islam, then you will definitely have some Ashari leanings. Even just to go back a little, when we are talking about the Ahl Sunnah, right? Specifically when it comes to Kalam, there's a great deal of debate that has been sparked all over again in on Twitter mostly, I guess, between the Salafis or the Atharis or the Hanbalites and the Asharites. The thing is that there's a reconciling figure there as well,
Okay.
and very orthodox Hanbali figure, Ibn Jawzi. So in one of his treatises, he actually just says Tawil is fine.
Hmm.
That's really just what it is. He quotes certain ahadith that talk about God's foot, and then he says, well, there's no way that the foot is an attribute. So,
Hmm.
well, there it is, right?
Right.
And so Sheikh Nuh Hamim Keller has worked a lot on this. It's just an interesting point, right? So these traditions, when there is an angle of refutation and deriding the other side, eventually a few hundred years later, it's like, okay, it's not
Ye-
so bad after
Yeah,
all.
it's not so bad.
It's not
Yeah,
so bad.
yeah.
There's a middle
Initially we
path.
were overreacting, but now we see your point as well.
Your point, you're right. Intellectual challenges arise. It's
Yeah.
unreasonable to say that God has physical hands, as certain
Yep.
authorities are saying. So it's an interesting tradition, without a doubt. There has been a lot of debate,
Hmm.
but the Sufi tradition is, in my opinion, and again, I regard every Muslim who says they're a Muslim, especially Ibn Arabi. I mean, his work is truly brilliant, even if I disagree with it. I find it to be the most dangerous in terms of belief, because
Hmm.
this is a very simplistic issue. This is a
Hmm.
very technical issue about what you believe God to be. It's not about whether God has one attribute or whether he has any attributes or what attributes are. This is about the being of God and your relationship as a creation to him.
Hmm. Hmm.
right?
I mean, even when you started talking about the Tanazzulat, the various stages of descent, the first three stages, it seems like we are dissecting what God
Yeah,
is, and we are
that's the truth.
dissecting starting from what is pure existence and what is the next level and what is the level where it takes on attributes, as if attributes are like clothes that you have to put on for it to become the being that we are familiar with.
And it's problematic because it's very uncomfortable to say that there is a technically a plane of existence higher than God. But
Yep.
technically, they're not saying that because everything is, one.
Hmm.
But if you really dissect it, it becomes a very problematic belief. And I remember Sheikh Yasir Qadhi in one of his library chats did say that, God knows best. They were really sincere because they were really trying to understand Tawheed to its best extent. It's
Hmm.
just, in my opinion, had the opposite effect.
Yeah.
Um, I just like to end with this one quote by Will Durant. The best defenders of a faith are typically
Hmm.
those who are exposed to the most challenges.
Right.
So I fear this is one of those situations. So I'll just end on this quote by Fariduddin Attar. He's a pretty famous Sufi,
Yep.
founder of the Attari order.
Yeah.
So let's
Conference of
just,
words. Hmm?
yes, yeah,
Mantakutayr.
mantak there. He says, and as his existence all the world pervades, naught in creation is save this alone. Upon the water has he fixed his throne, the earth suspended in the starry space. Yet what are seas and what is air? For all is God, and but a talisman are heaven and earth, to wail divinity. For heaven and earth did he not permeate them, were but names. Know them that both this visible world and that which unseen is alike are God himself. Naught is save God, and all that is God.
All right.
I
I
think
think
this
I
is
think
pretty.
the last line just sums it up.
Yeah, yeah, it
And
does
that
really.
is that is Sufism. That is Sufism at its core.
But I would just like to say, not all Sufis believe this. There is
Hmm.
the Sufi tradition is a very diverse tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Find very orthodox Sufis who don't believe this, who are just Asharis, plain and simple Maturidis at the most. Some are
Hmm.
Mu'tazili, but they'll interpret, even if they do call Ibn Arabi Shaykh al-Akbar, they'll just say he was an Ashari. They'll
Hmm.
have a very typical creed, and these are things that are not discussed ever, except
Yep.
in the Majalis of the Khawas.
Yeah. But the thing is that if you if you exclude Wahdatul Wajud, then what have you really done different? Why do you even call yourself a Sufi?
I'll tell you why actually.
Hmm.
Because there is a part of our religion
Hmm.
that we can call to be ihsan, that is
Hmm.
the real dimension of worship. I think that Sufis, and that is a historical reality as well. Sufism initially began as a study of ihsan. So you had
Hmm.
fiqh studying law, kalam studying aqidah, and then you had Sufism or Sufis who studied ihsan, the best way to worship God, the best ways to connect with God, to build a relationship with Him, because God for us is a living entity. He is someone you can talk to, He is someone you can have a relationship with, a connection with, that helps you, right? It navigates your life, it governs your life. There's a way to enjoy worship, to make it not a task, but something that comes out of love, something that comes out of affection, something that helps you fulfill your natural, innate, psychological desire to have a being worthy of worship.
Hmm.
That's where it came from. In that, you can see the connection here, right? As we're
Yep.
trying to veil ourselves and as we're trying to let go of our ego, you eventually arrive at this.
Yep. Or
By
as you're trying to love God, you have to get rid of all other loves from your
yeah, yeah,
life.
so
Otherwise,
I
they'll stand in between.
yeah, that's the part, right? So La Mawjud illallah initially came from here, that
Hmm.
nothing else matters, God alone matters. And
Hmm.
as a sort of emotion, sure, fine, a bit extreme, but it's not kufr.
Hmm.
This becomes especially problematic because if this is your conception of God, then the idea of Tawheed that the Quran gives you is really just kept aside. And sadly, my eponym Shah, it comes from Shah Waliullah. Back when I thought he was
Mm,
a Salafi, or not a Salafi, but a reformer who was very anti superstition. And he
mm,
is,
mm.
except when it comes to this.
Yeah.
Except when it comes to this. So he actually says that the Tawheed of the Quran and the Ahadith and all of that, it's just for
Mm,
normal people. We don't derive it from here. And the reason why I focus so much on Shah Waliullah is because he is the last great Sufi.
mm.
He's the last proper theologian, talks about all of this.
Yeah.
After him, there's really no one else.
Yeah. And because of him, majority of subcontinent is into Sufism.
Yeah, because you can trace Deoband and Bareli back to Shah
Yeah,
Waliullah.
yeah.
And
All of them to him.
so, and hilariously, you even trace the Wahhabis back to him, I guess, in a brilliant twist of irony. And Shah
All
Ismail
right.
Shaheed in his Abakat. I've
Hmm.
never been able to read the Abakat. Ghamli Saab recommended it, but I don't
Hmm.
know. For
It's all right.
That's the
Okay, I
last.
suppose that is a good note to conclude things on. I hope in this conversation people might have picked up a few things about what Sufism is, its intellectual trends, some of the figures, and how it might and might not line with traditional or orthodox beliefs, and it's up to people to think how much they themselves agree with you know their endeavors or their intellectual conquests, I would like to call them, and what they brought forward. So on this note, I would like to thank you, Shah, and we'll probably meet in another session. Yeah, thank you
Yes.
very much.